my talk, which I don't usually do, but I have things for you to look at other than myself. And also to make it easier for me to click on my laptop here when I want to change the screen. So I hope I am reasonably visible and audible. And if you can't hear me, just let me know and I'll try to speak up. So my talk today is an opening gesture toward a project inspired by an act of God. The destruction by lightning of a 60-foot statue of Jesus that, until 16 months ago, loomed over Interstate 75 at its 30-mile marker just north of Cincinnati. More precisely, the project is inspired by public responses to the destruction of Jesus, we'll say, who for the short 6 years of his existence had made something of a name for himself, as well as for the solid rock church that built him, and for the small town turned exurb of Monroe, Ohio, his sometimes reluctant home community. Now, I'd been aware of the statue for some time prior to its destruction, having seen it many times on my frequent drives from Detroit to the northern Kentucky region where I grew up. My initial interest in it had been enhanced by the fact that upon my first sighting, the statue was not quite completed. The upraised arms were not finished, but the apparatus that apparently would serve to hold them on from the elbows upward was clearly visible in a way that, to me, gave Jesus the appearance of an amputee, one apparently sinking into the reflecting pool in which the statue was placed. Thus, I objected to the statue on what I believed were theological grounds. For example, why would Jesus be sinking? Why must he be represented as being in agony? Was he cursing God about the arms? But my primary objection to the statue was, to be honest, rather simply aesthetic. The thing was just too big. As you might expect, I was not the only critic of the statue, which during its construction and for the first few months after its completion apparently interfered substantially with the flow of traffic between Cincinnati and Dayton. One local resident in a Your Voice column for the Cincinnati Enquirer mentioned the statue as an example of the urban sprawl, congestion, and so-called bad taste plaguing the presumably once bucolic greater Monroe area. But the statue also had its defenders, of course, some of whom occasionally called the Solid Rock Church to report the instances of renewed faith it had inspired. In time, the locals became reasonably comfortable with the statue, and it earned a number of nicknames. Super Savior was an early favorite, but the one that gained the widest currency was, somewhat predictably, Touchdown Jesus. Numerous travelers paused on their journeys through Monroe to take pictures of the statue and of themselves with the statue. Hundreds of such photos are available, of course, on the internet. It took me weeks to figure out that they're spelling Ohio. I don't know why. I just didn't get it. And then came June 14th, 2010, and the proverbial dark and stormy night. One of the first 911 callers, who was driving at high speed along the expressway just as lightning struck the statue, could hardly believe his eyes. Now, I'm hoping that I'm connected, actually. I'm going to test this out. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. Sorry.
Yes, I'm actually out here on I-75, and I swear to God this is not a prank. I just saw, the Touchdown Jesus, the church there. Yeah. Just saw lightning strike it, and it's on fire. The Touchdown Jesus is on fire? Yes, it is, sir. I swear to God, I'm not making this up. I know it's not funny, but it's literally, his one hand is on fire right now. His one hand's on fire? Yes. No, and I'm serious. I've been driving out here on I-75. I just saw it get struck by lightning. I believe you. What hand is it? It's the right hand. The right hand? Yes. All right. I'm going to move away out there, sir. Okay, thank you.
Actually, it was the left hand. He was looking at it, So by the time the first responders had arrived on the scene, which hand it was no longer mattered. The heat of the lightning had ignited the fumes of the statue's otherwise non-flammable primary construction material, styrofoam. Quickly bursting into a 6-story fireball, Touchdown Jesus was burned beyond recognition by daybreak. Already something of an internet sensation, Touchdown Jesus became the subject of thousands of comments upon his demise. I stumbled across these comments as I searched for news reports and video of the fire, and I found myself wasting inordinate amounts of time reading them. Though some comments seized upon the occasion to engage in hate speech against particular groups, generally fundamentalist Christians or even Muslims, most of the talk was jovial. Whether the lightning strike was seen as an act of God, or of Zeus, or of Odin, hardly anyone seemed sorry to see Touchdown Jesus go. Now, the parenthesis here, I've never been especially impressed by the quality of civic discourse as it appears on discussion boards. So my initial response or approach was not scholarly. Further, I was not surprised by the quality of the discourse surrounding this particular event. There were football-themed comments, of course, and I do have a favorite. I believe it summed up the irony of the event fairly well. So, upon further review, wrote Chris Cody, whoops, it wasn't a touchdown after all. And then there were some religiously based comments, of course. Give it 3 days, wrote as others engaged in more serious discussion about the Ten Commandments, with an especially lively debate about which one of them prohibited graven images. Was it the first, fourth, the second? Or was it the Second Amendment, mused Terry Dart. Either way, wrote Blue to the Bone, 1635, the Fourth Commandment and Second Amendment both meet with predictable results. As I began to collect a few of my favorites, however, an unexpected pattern began to emerge. A fair number of readers commented specifically about the credentials of Touchdown Jesus' creators, having noted a newspaper report on the background of the church's pastor, Lawrence Bishop. A God-fearing pastor, former horse trader, and one-time towel boy at Plato's Retreat, wrote one comment. Bishop also owned the huge flea market next door, another comment claimed. Others characterized both Bishop and his co-pastor and wife, Darlene Bishop, as money grubbers. Numerous other comments suggested that the $250,000 price tag for the statue's construction could have been put to better use. A $250,000 idol up in smoke, wrote Barry Weber, $250,000 held back from hungry children, AIDS patients, landmine victims, abused women, and animal rescue organizations. And Dundu agreed, suggesting that the members of Solid Rock reconsider their commitment to helping the poor and supporting suffering missionaries, rather than putting their money into such an expensive artifact. So the poor, starving children, humanitarian leaders, the mess in the Gulf that was occurring at the time, even engineers are all suggested as potential beneficiaries, as what Jesus would do, whether with the original $250,000 or the insurance money, unless, of course, the insurance company invoked its Act of God clause. Even more commentary, however, was dedicated to the statue's size. 60-foot Jesus and 6-story Jesus became common epithets, as words like big, giant, and huge somehow failed to adequately express the enormity of it all. And like the tragedy, Touchdown Jesus' flaws seem to have been scaled to their 6-story magnitude. The statue was gaudy, wrote Gigantopithecus, perhaps ironically, in its hideousness bearing a remarkable likeness to Jerry Garcia, wrote Debbie Reeves. With its insurance settlement, speculated Loves Willie, the church could build an even bigger statue. Geez, it'll be Jesus-illa, she or he wrote. Run for your lives. Chimed in Chat Malley, not even Jesus wants to see Jesus so huge. But an equally sizable chunk of the commentary focused on the perceived inappropriateness of the materials chosen for the construction. If it's not made out of stone, wrote Binary Man, it's just an oversized lawn ornament. So the thing was 6 stories tall, added Fantastic Four fan, and they made it out of something that is only slightly more fireproof than paper mache. Characterized as constructed out of plastic, foam, wood, rosin, recycled garbage, wrote one comment. With a steel skeleton and sitting in the middle of a lake, it was a glorified lightning rod, stated Zoria, who clearly did not understand the physics of lightning rods, as CPA with ADD was quick to point out. The church would have done better to construct the statue out of its namesake material, solid rock, thought La Casa Rosada, but instead, they made their Jesus out of ticky-tacky. Now, interestingly, a number of locals rose to contest the characterization of the statue as Touchdown Jesus, doing so on the basis of its presumed material construction. Hey guys, wrote Mr. Larry, this is Big Butter Jesus, not Touchdown Jesus. Nobody here calls it Touchdown Jesus. This and other comments, such as Beaky Buzzard's Sweet Butter Jesus on Fire, referred to a comic country song written and performed by one Haywood Banks, who, on first sighting the statue, concluded its lumpy yellowish whiteness suggested it was akin to such state fair-style creations as cows made out of corn cobs, Garth Brooks out of string cheese, or the Virgin out of olives. Banks's refrain suggests that one element of his objection to the statue is quite similar to that of the others who complain about styrofoam. I'm going to play just the refrain, 30 seconds. I hope.
Big butter Jesus, sweet cream Jesus, old country fresh Jesus.
I'm going to try it with him.
Big butter Jesus, sweet cream Jesus, old country fresh Jesus, unsalted Jesus, all promise Jesus, imperial Jesus, can't believe it's not Jesus, oh Lord.
Goes on, we won't. But this refrain reminds me of a common internet claim, first of all, that margarine is only one molecule removed from plastic, which, though debunked by Snopes.com, indicates that Banks's song taps into commonly held suspicions regarding the unnatural, by which I mean manufactured, and especially trademarked products. Believe it or not, I'm going to return to this song, we won't play it, but to some of his commentary and my conclusion. But for now, I think that the public discussion is aptly summed up by a comment coming from a reader with my favorite username, His Pet Goat, which wrote, "This is probably why the Florentines didn't work in plastic foam and fiberglass." Probably so, I thought. And then I too was struck, not by lightning, but by a metaphysical revelation of Aristotelian proportions. The size of the statue, in other words, its form, and the supposed inappropriateness of the materials chosen to construct the form of Jesus in particular, the identity and credentials of its creators and their intentions, the better uses to which the money could have been applied. What I've been seeing as fairly inane public chatter is actually citing all four of the causes that Aristotle discusses at some length in his Physics and Metaphysics, in his own quest to formulate an answer to the question, how do things come to be? Formal and material, efficient and final, the discussion covered them all. Because it was fairly certain that few to none of the discussants had recently read Aristotle, the coincidence seemed uncanny, and I became convinced it had to mean something. So I engaged in a quest to figure out what that meaning could possibly be. Now, I've said already, in my title at least, that I'm interested in pursuing a rhetorical approach to the causes, which have traditionally been seen as a metaphysical category. As I currently understand it, and I'm still studying it, a metaphysical approach may be inclined to study causation as it applies to natural things or quasi-divinely created circumstances that humans, by definition, do not set in motion. The metaphysical quest may also be to determine what is actually the case, in other words, the truth about how things come to be. A rhetorical approach to the causes will be interested in studying things that people bring into being, those artificial, human-made artifacts with which we people our world. Characterized by Aristotle as a form of making, rhetoric itself can be seen as a human-made artifact, a method that leads to the production of other concrete, human-made things, ranging from speeches and texts to performances and symbolic objects. A rhetorical approach would therefore be far more interested in understanding how we, by which I mean not people in general, but people in a specific circumstance, think and talk about concepts of causation. So in other words, a rhetorical approach wants to examine what people believe about the things they make and how they come into being. The discipline of rhetoric has become increasingly interested in the concept of materiality over the last 15 years or so, developing a subdiscipline in what is called material rhetoric, with related areas sometimes designated as embodied rhetoric or rhetoric of the body. These disciplines study how material circumstances in which concrete artifacts may figure constrain who may speak or be heard and what may be said in a given situation. Frequently, though, material rhetoric is frustratingly immaterial to my mind, sometimes using the body as a sort of catchphrase to stand in for the material without dealing with either in its concrete details. It's somewhat surprising to me, given the field's derivation from Aristotle, which I acknowledge as a derivation our sophist, happy postmodern moment yearns to forget, that our work does not draw on the obvious presence of Aristotelian causality in the Aristotelian rhetorical system. We could do so, I believe, to structure our attempts to concretize the material, at the very least by drawing on the four causes of making, as Robert R. Johnson has named them, to get at the question of what we believe about the nature of our own productions. To do so may allow us to give objects their due, as my colleague Richard Marbeck has suggested we should, without completely surrendering ourselves to what he calls their brute stability, thus dehumanizing them in such a way that we potentially absolve ourselves of all responsibility for their existence. Where Marbeck argues that we need to stop interpreting objects through a process of personal projection, I would argue that we need to recognize that human-made objects are personal projections, and that giving them their due requires that we recognize what we have done. These were among my thoughts, at any rate, as I pondered the event, and what most intrigued me about it, the public's apparently deep-seated and virulent antipathy to styrofoam. Somewhat stymied, I quite uncharacteristically began to articulate a number of hypotheses about the matter, three of which I'm now going to discuss in the time I have remaining. So hypothesis one could be Aristotle was right. It's fairly uninteresting, but it does raise a question, right about what? One potential answer might be that he was right in his response to the question he was himself asking about how things come to be. While the history and development of science have shown decisively that Aristotle was not right in many of his theories about how natural things come to be, one might argue that with respect to artificial products, considering the producer, the materials, the form, and the intended or actual use of a product might well provide an adequate, straightforward, and for that reason, I think, potentially dull account of it. So a second version of this hypothesis bears slightly more rhetorical interest, suggesting that regardless of whether Aristotle was right about how things come to be, he was certainly right about how we think about that process. Or alternatively, that Aristotle's philosophy is so successful and his ideas so entrenched in Western thought that we still, 2,500 years later, think as he suggested we think. However, it's not my goal here to promote Aristotle. Though noting Aristotelian thought processes from 21st century daily discourse is interesting, that observation does not in itself explain why people who could respond to the statue so variously, from seeing it as a representation of their personal savior to dismissing it as a mere pile of trash, could find themselves in such harmonious accord about the metaphysical faux pas of using styrofoam to build it. So on to hypothesis 2. I find somewhat more interesting and recognizes the obvious, that styrofoam is an artificial material, and one perceived as somewhat cheap given its common appearance in daily products ranging from picnic plates and cups to packaging peanuts. Public antipathy to styrofoam statue of Jesus, then, may indicate a common belief that more natural materials are themselves more close to the divine, and thus to be preferred to more mundane, that is, less valuable, materials for representation of a deity or near deity. Let's note briefly, however, the conflict here. The statue itself is an artificial product. As an embodiment of the rationale behind the Second Commandment prohibition of graven images, it represents the human aspiration to create an image, along with the subsequent temptation to worship it. Perhaps it's better then to use cheap materials that are less likely to become an object of worship, as gold may be, for example, and especially so if the expense of creating the statue is seen, as indeed it is seen, as a waste of money that could have been put to better uses. So hypothesis 3. It builds on hypothesis 2 as it contends that there's something deeply spiritual about our responses to materials and forms, even when the materials are mundane and the forms may not be those of deities. Let's return to a comment on the statue to which I briefly referred at the beginning of my talk. Local resident Catherine Hilker's accusation that the then newly constructed statue was an example of bad taste. Here's a bit more of what she wrote. Just up the road in Monroe, not only do we have our very own Hustler store, but also, as if to add balance to the community, we have a 42-foot statue of Christ at the Solid Rock Church. Now, I am not against a statue of Christ. In fact, I'm not against a statue of anybody. I once traveled to Japan to see the famous Great Buddha of Kamakura. Cast in 1252 AD, this statue stands, actually it sits, 43 feet, 7.5 inches. Easy to see when traveling north on Interstate 75, Christ's statue is made of plastic. Hard to locate, the Buddha is made of bronze and weighs 121 tons. The fact that leads me to believe that things were not all that bad in the 1252 AD art community. Now, fully unpacking this one paragraph wouldn't be practical here, but I want to look closely at Hooker's two most articulate sentences as she aptly compares the plastic Christ and the bronze Buddha. They're of comparable height, she suggests, but we may conclude that the bronze Buddha would be much taller than the plastic Christ if it were to stand up, and that it is presumably much weightier. The plastic Christ is publicly located, while the bronze Buddha is hidden. Bronze Buddha apparently participated in the life of the strong arts community, whereas plastic Christ hangs out with Larry Flint. Not to mention, as Hilker does not, the gigantic flea market, which in all likelihood is not owned by the Solid Rock pastors, and not to be left out, a Waffle House. The material construction of these statues is, however, clearly a symptom of deeper issues. Styrofoam, a plastic polymer, is about 98% air, suggesting that plastic Christ is something of a lightweight compared to bronze Buddha. But bronze, too, is an artificial material, an alloy of copper and tin. The fact that styrofoam first became a glimmer in a scientist's eye in 1839 makes it a come lately compared to bronze, which humans first made about 1,000 years before Aristotle. Its long history may have allowed us to naturalize bronze in our minds, but artificial it most certainly is, as is its close cousin brass, an alloy of copper and zinc. Further, plastic is pliable, so plastic Christ is not only a lightweight, but also may be an unreliably wishy-washy savior. By way of contrast, a 121-ton seated Buddha would clearly be difficult to sway. But most significant, I believe, is Hilker's comment about the comparative visibility of these two statues. It's as though she's complaining that the statue soon to be known as Touchdown Jesus was too, brazen, showing its gigantic plastic face to God in the interstate in what the OED defines as shameless effrontery. Thoroughly modern plastic Touchdown Jesus, made of, surrounded by, and swallowed up by the artificial, is not only too phony, not only too big, he's just too available. It's in this sense that I say that our responses to materials and forms and to the way we bring them into relationship through the things we ourselves make are deeply spiritual. They are so in a sense that Martin Heidegger notes in his discussion of the nature of Aristotle's concept of causation, as he counters what he notes are merely correct understandings of human-made artifacts with a true understanding of their essences. Though as a rhetorician, I am not given to pursuing the true or essence, as is Heidegger, his rearticulation of Aristotle's sense of causation notes that the four causes do not function in a cause-effect linearity that we tend to impose on them. A cause, says Heidegger, is not something that brings something else about. In this sense, we may no longer say that artifacts originate in their efficient cause, their human makers, but in a dynamic relationship among the causes, which are, according to Heidegger, ways all belonging at once to each other of being responsible for something else. Heidegger thus disputes the truth, if not the correctness, of both the instrumental and the anthropological understanding of artifacts, respectively, that we create artifacts simply in order to accomplish some end to which they are the means, or that the making of artifacts is better understood as a deeply human or human-centered activity. The dangers of these seemingly innocuous theories about how and why we make things, according to Heidegger, is that in our current era, though not in Aristotle's, we no longer bring things into being in accordance with their proper nature. Instead, we challenge them for it, demanding that the things we make provide us with a ready reserve of whatever it is we believe we are making them for. Heidegger's clearest example of this tendency lies in his comparison of a windmill, which will generate power just as long as the wind blows, with a dam placed in a river, which generates power continuously and then stores it up for future use. In Aristotle's terms, human making involved bringing into being something for which existence was optional. Unless we make it, in other words, it will not be. In Heidegger's elaboration of Aristotle's terms, human making ideally involves revealing the existence of something that was already potentially there. It's in this sense that Aristotle saw artisans as cooperating with their material's desire for appropriate form. When we challenge something forth, rather than usher it into being, we demand that the unconcealed, the mysterious, reveal itself to us and then stand by awaiting orders with respect to our purposes for it. We risk constructing a styrofoam Jesus. The greatest danger, says Heidegger, in the relationship we have to our own products, is that everything in the world is thereby given over to an instrumental, fairly linear cause and effect way of thinking in which some things that must, or at least should, remain mysterious in order to retain their power and meaning, appear somewhat frail when we force them into the open. Inherent in exposing the mysterious is, he says, the danger that man may misconstrue the unconcealed and misinterpret it. Thus, where everything exhibits in the light of a cause-effect coherence, even God can lose all that's exalted and holy, the mysteriousness of distance. Thus, God can sink to the level of a cause. That is to say, the level of the efficient cause, in a very mere kind of sense, just one of the four and merely co-responsible with us, with our forms and our materials, for accomplishing our purposes. I believe this statement holds the key to understanding why Jesus should not, in the public eye, be made of styrofoam. For it appears we do believe we have challenged him forth, brought him out of unconcealment, and made Jesus in our image. An image that, exposed to the light of day at the edge of the interstate, as a deity summoned forth to serve as standing reserve, as a stockpile of ready answers to all our as yet unformulated prayers, seems patently unable to do what it is we would have it do. Do our images of Jesus really become Jesus to us? Now, to look back at the song, and I really do cringe to quote it near my conclusion, but I'm going to anyway, the refrain suggests, I think, that we do see our creations as real. Can't believe it's not Jesus, he says in his refrain. And in introducing a performance of the song, also says, it's kind of interesting that your initial reaction to the statue and who the statue is the same word. Banks is joking, of course, but in this statement, which invokes the idea that the statue is its own near essence, I believe he's on to something. So in short, I believe Heidegger is right. In a world that believes in instrumental cause and effect, and in a deity that may be challenged forth as a means to our ends, to set things right, as it were, in the world in our opinions, even if it takes forever, the concept of God as an efficient cause is a degraded concept, and one that we're very aware is of our own making. Which raises one last question, at least for me and for now. Why do we make anything? One provisional answer is that we make because we desire to make, and to do so in order to fill a void that we perceive, a lack that we feel. But in filling this particular void with our own styrofoam image, we seem to have rendered God helpless along with ourselves. As to the statue itself, rather than to the concept it embodies, can we believe it's not Jesus? According to the woman who brought it into being, first as an image in her own mind, and eventually in all its plastic hugeness, of course we can. Asked by a reporter from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette whether its destruction was a sign from God, Darlene Bishop, co-pastor of Solid Rock, shrugged off the possibility. Honey, she responded, it's just some fiberglass. That statement, far from settling the issue, just raises more question and really sends us back to where we began. But that's not such a bad place to be, and certainly I believe it's a fine place to start with your questions, which I know invite. Yes, Ellen.
Did they rebuild it?
They are rebuilding it right now.
Out of?
Non-flammable materials, and I don't remember exactly what the material is, and I found a picture, a prototype of it. It's Jesus full length, standing with his arms down, so no more touchdown. And its name will be Come Unto Me.
Yeah.
Go find Jesus.
Yeah, right. I don't know. So, somebody will find a way to make fun of it, I'm sure. But I was told by my sister who drove by that the skeleton was up a couple weeks ago. Also, as an update, I guess I should say that the pastor, Lawrence Bishop, back in October, died suddenly of a stroke. The church got even more publicity.
Had they better insulate it?
Apparently, they thought they had a fire retardant system established. You know, I don't know if they had a lightning rod system established for the other one, and it was a really huge storm. But they certainly believe this won't happen again. Although just rebuilding it is controversial.
If I missed this, where did all of this discourse take place? I mean, online.
The ones that I'm quoting in this presentation all came from the Huffington Post, which had like 70 pages of commentary, but you know, it was all over. The Enquirer had a write your own headline contest, and people wrote snappy headlines regarding the event.
So I know the larger project that this is part of is in the early stages, but I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, I'm predicting from the conclusion of this talk that you're that project will focus more on intersections between materiality and spirituality and rhetoric, and I just wondered if there's a
I
preview.
honestly don't know. As I was writing this, I just happened to be, I've been looking at this discourse for quite some time, and then I just assigned my students to read Heidegger, which I had read before. But I had never really paid much attention to that one particular paragraph, and it wasn't until I found that paragraph and matched it up with Coker's comments about, the Buddha being concealed, that I started to develop that idea. What I want to do is look at various perceptions of material circumstances and really material artifacts. So I anticipate that one of the next things I may write would be about the case of Nathaniel Abraham. I don't know if you all remember who he was. Right when I moved to Detroit, I think he was on trial. At the age of 9, he had shot and killed a man named Ronnie Green, who was waiting in line to get a lottery ticket. And Jeffrey Feiger defended him. He was found guilty of second-degree murder in a controversial trial that tried him as an adult at the age of 11 for something he had done at the age of 9. But then he got a blended sentence so that he started serving a juvenile term, and if he could show that he had been rehabilitated, then he would be released on his 21st birthday, which he was. But that created a whole firestorm, and I don't know if you all remember this, about the suit that he wore. So, he walked out of jail dressed in what could be characterized as a modified zoot suit, pink, with hat and the gaiters, vest and a rabbit fur coat. And so even though the newspaper was trying to direct discussion in its article toward the question of rehabilitation and, trying children, and all these horrible things, poverty and all the things that created the circumstances, the public discourse was all about the suit. And linked it to Kwame Kilpatrick, who was the mayor at that time. And there were huge discussions about, whether if you understand the African American community, you could understand, that people will wear this suit to church, and other people would get on and say, not my church. So, I want to pursue the idea of material rhetoric in a way that is really concrete, saying, here's how we look at these things. This is how we allocate responsibility for them, in addition to interpreting them, because rhetoric for me is a productive art. It's all about bringing things into existence and then trying to allocate understanding and responsibility for the things that we make. So I don't know what's going to happen.
No, but that's helpful, that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, Amy.
So it reminds me, this morning when I was driving in to campus, there was a story on NPR about the problem with releasing balloons into, this ceremonial sort of symbolic act of releasing balloons into the atmosphere and environment, and how they end up in oceans and they don't degrade and they, whatever. And so, I don't mean to say whatever to sort of downplay the importance of the implications, but the talk was that they're trying to develop a plastic that will degrade, so marine life don't consume it, and whatever, these problems won't occur. And of course, like, my initial thought is, well, why can't we just get over not send, why can't we just stop this symbolic act of balloons? And it seems like we need to develop a plastic more so that we need to convince people that they can do other things than release balloons into the atmosphere as a symbolic act of or representation of whatever. And so the way that I thought about it in relation to Touchdown Jesus is that as an artifact, it's constructed, it or the Buddha or whatever, is constructed to remain, right, to stay and be seen, whereas this plastic, this, if we see it as being challenged forth, in Heideggerian terms, is precisely challenged forth to go away, to disintegrate, to not to leave. And I wonder if, that is something that, that act of challenging forth that particular material, as these scientists are creating it, just as they created styrofoam, could be regarded, in the same way if it's not meant to be, an an artifact that stays material, that is, you know, meant to be around for us to see and regard. And I just think it's interesting, you know, one thing meant to stay, to withstand, right? The problem is the styrofoam is, you know, so flimsy, or, you know, even so the effort going into building styrofoam, I think some people would take issue. Like perhaps it's more difficult to carve it out of stone, so that would, you know, somehow have a greater significance. But again, it's meant to be there and to endure, whereas this plastic is meant to go away.
Yeah, you phrased a number of things. I mean, I don't know if I can really speculate too much about what you're saying, but you have raised a couple of issues that are really important. One is that, you know, the releasing of the balloons is a symbolic act. And so that says once again that, you know, we embed sort of spiritual beliefs into these balloons, you know, because they're filled with air, they go up toward the heavens, and we're not thinking beyond the point where, you know, they pop and land in the ocean and, you know, choke fish and that kind of thing. So, you know, I think again, you know, it's just such a strong urge that we are going to engage in symbolic acts and not necessarily pursue their consequences as far as we might, because doing so kind of destroys the symbolism. You know, when you're releasing the soul of a person and then it ends up gagging a fish, you know, you don't want to think about that. Also, in the question of whether we need to be exerting our energy to develop this, you know, classic, or whether we could just convince people to stop conducting this particular act. And actually, we did get people to start throwing, what did we do? Throwing birdseed instead of rice at weddings. Right. And there was some reason for that. At least we can feed the birds while we're at it. There's always this sense, you know, this compulsion to make things, and in terms of critical theory of technology, the belief that if we can make it, we should. Or if they can make it, we can't stop them. And that, you know, these things are just going to happen, and once we have this thing, by, you know, compulsion, we're going to use it. So, you know, we just feel compelled by some force, you know, outside of ourselves or possibly deeply within ourselves to just keep doing this stuff and dealing with, you know, these unintended consequences with more stuff. Reminds me of the story of the kudzu in the South. We have a lot of brilliant ideas, and then we discover that, you know, they weren't so brilliant after all. Yes.
Yeah, the situation reminds me a little bit of, I think it was Shelley wrote a poem about this Egyptian statue of Ozymandias.
I do not know Shelley.
Okay,
People here who do.
you know, the statue was purported to be, you know, going to last for eternity, and it's crumbling. As a matter of fact, I saw it once, and it's less noticeable than the average big boy sign. You know, it's very conditioned. You know, it was intended to be very impressive, and it's just falling apart. You know, so, I don't know what Shelley would think of styrofoam.
Unfortunately, I don't think Shelley had to deal with styrofoam.
Lucky for her.
That's bad.
This is branching out quite a lot, but the end of your talk suddenly made me think about not a material source of causation, but information as a material thing that we're bringing forth through the internet, and sort of like Heidegger would put it, challenging it forth, maybe artificially. I know that that's not something a lot of people would agree with, but I'm doing my essay, as you know, on health information online, and there's just an I would have to say, overabundance of it. Nobody knows what to select or what is correct and true. And in some ways, your discussion also made me think about maybe the spirituality of what we think of as medical knowledge. You know, it's the place of doctors and those people, and now it's being put out for everybody, which is a good thing if it's done responsibly, of course. So,
I think that's authority and spirituality. How would you say that's spiritual?
yeah, I agree with that. It's interesting that I suddenly thought of it in a spiritual sense, and authoritative is a much better definition of it. And I don't know, it's just maybe family background or something, you know, doctors in the family. It's just we all put them up on a pedestal and kind of thought of them as, you know, higher beings or something. But it is, as you would say, not strictly spiritual. Unless you thought about
there
it.
is a cliche
It's
about
a
doctors claim that. So maybe-
Yeah, kind of a mysterious source of the knowledge. They hold it, and if you want to see the knowledge, you go to the doctor.
we don't need to do that anymore, so things are kind of shifting.
There is quite a bit of research about the nature of specialized language, and its use to confine expertise to a particular cause, which would suggest that maybe information or language or something that the doctors possess is something that in your example of putting just research articles online in PubMed is sort of a phony gesture toward making the information available, but if nobody can really read and understand it, it still retains ownership of that particular material.
Am I right to recall that Aristotle wrote a rhetoric?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Then I'm able to ask my question, which is, does he talk about the four causes in terms of his rhetoric?
He doesn't say causes in the rhetoric, but it's very clear that as he has set up his rhetorical system, he is keeping those causes in mind. So first of all, in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he characterizes different forms of knowledge, one of them is making. That's a techne. It's production. And when he writes his rhetoric, which he wrote, I think the second to last thing that he wrote, he said that rhetoric specifically was a techne. So if you import all the things that he says about techne into the rhetoric, first of all, you can say that it is a process of production that involves a certain form of material. So he construes the maker, for example, as an efficient cause when he discusses techne. There is the material that the maker must work with, and he goes into a fair amount of detail about, and this is not in rhetoric, in the Nicomachean Ethics, about how an artist can work with materials and whether the materials are reliable or unreliable, or whether the artist has skill or not with respect to those materials, whether the artist is say, respecting the nature of the materials and creating a product. So that in the rhetoric, when he talks about the materials, he's talking about the enthymeme, for example, as the body of proof, and various forms of appeals that writers can use. And he also specifically then locates the end of rhetoric, the final cause, in either the use of a product or in its audience or users, who hear the speech, for example, and then go do something. So the whole idea of causality is implicit in the rhetoric, but he doesn't say what the first cause is.
What is an unreliable material to diverge further?
I think that's maybe a later addition onto Aristotle, the question of whether materials are reliable, because he did see materials as having a desire for a particular and appropriate form. And one of the things that people are saying in this discussion is that styrofoam is overextending itself. It has a desire for a form that it really is not worthy of. But Aristotle also talks about the concept of error, and whether if you make a mistake or if the result of your speech is not justice and the good, is that your fault? Is it the fault of your argument, or is it the fault of the people who hear you talk? And Aristotle actually locates it somewhat controversially in the hearers of the talk, because he says that truth and justice naturally are more persuasive. So if people haven't heard your material say truth correctly, they may go off and do something wrong.
But wouldn't the material be words?
It could be words. When I was trying to...
Notoriously unreliable material.
Yes, it is. I mean, that's one of the things that I put in the last chapter of my book when I was trying to apply these four causes to legal rhetoric. And it depends, where you put language in that structure of causation depends on what you believe about what law can do. If language is your material, law's a mess. But if you see the body of law as your material, like laws themselves, and you don't break it down into its constituent material, which is language, or you see language as something that should be razor sharp and honeable, then you can see law as having more